Hi everyone, welcome. So what I'm going to talk to you about today is getting to the right API faster. So we're seeing AI augmented tooling bleed into all facets of software delivery, but are we actually confident that it's delivering what we want? And more importantly, is it delivering what our customers or their users want and meeting their developer expectations? There's also a new hungry API consumer in town, and are we actually delivering to AI agents what they need to carry out complex actions on our behalf, something that is defined by a term called agent experience. So what I'm going to propose is a mix of human-centered low-tech techniques, which when combined with standards and specifications like OpenAPI and Arazzo can really help us deliver the right API faster. And it gives us also the option to benefit from the AI tooling that we're finding around ourselves and getting us to the point where we can be confident that the APIs we craft are AI ready. So we can meet human developer experience needs while also meeting the agent experience needs. So my name is Killcommins. I'm Principal API Technical Evangelist at SmartBear. In conjunction with my work at SmartBear, I also work quite a lot with the OpenAPI initiative. And before we get started, let me just kind of clear up some definitions so we're all on the same page. So when I talk about developer experience, what I'm actually referring to is the overall quality of a developer's interaction with their environment. And that's a combination of the tools, processes, and organizational culture while they're trying to achieve their jobs to be done. If I put a specific API consumer lens on that, then it's the ease and confidence with which developers can discover, understand, and reliably integrate an API. And this should be driven by clear documentation, consistent design, and of course, meaningful runtime and consistent behaviors. And then if I talk about agent experience, well, this is defined by the guys at agentexperience.ax, and it's the overall quality of an AI agent's ability to access, understand, and reliably operate within a product, platform, or system to achieve user-defined goals. But do we actually understand what an AI agent is? And I kind of like to kind of categorize it or compare it against chatbots, which we're more familiar with, that have been around for a decade or more. And the main difference between a chatbot and an agent is action. So chatbots chat, but agents act. And generally, agents act via APIs. So whether that's a remote REST web service or a local STDIO on their machine, or maybe interacting with a CLI. And again, if I put an API consumer lens on agent experience, then it's the ease and reliability with which AI agents can discover, reason about, and safely execute API operations enabled by rich machine-readable documentation, clear boundaries, and again, predictable runtime behaviors. So one could argue that all AI really needs to use an API is good documentation. And that's actually very, very true. Documentation is critically important. And if we look at, agent tooling and experience and view it as a knowledge problem, then it really is the breadth of API documentation that dictates the range of agent capabilities that can be carried out. And it's the depth of documentation that dictates its reliability. So the quality of API documentation can drive both capable agent planning and reliable tool execution and evaluation. So if an agent's tool or API spec, for example, is vague, ambiguous, or even incomplete, then the risk is that an agent will call the wrong tool or the wrong API. Maybe they'll manage to call the right tool or API, but in the wrong way, or they might misinterpret responses, and that can more often than not just leading to them failing silently. So this leaves us kind of in the familiar bottom left quadrant of this graph, which is we have something that is cool for demos and hello world applications, but it's not something that we would use in production. And what we want to strive to do is get to the top right of this quadrant where we have robust, scalable agents. And documentation really can provide a key role in that. And there's one part of API documentation that is often undervalued and overlooked, and that is the power of examples. They're incredibly important for improving human cognitive understanding of how an API actually operates, and the same holds true for machines. And if we look and compare the examples that might be held within an OpenAPI description, they're actually twice as effective than code samples when it comes to improving the understanding of an API consumer with respect to how an API functions. So all we really need is, practical API governance to ensure that we deliver and meet these expectations from a developer or an agent experience. And there's continuously two questions that we should ask ourselves. Are we building the right API? And that's the validation part, and that's what I'm going to focus on today. And then can we use the tooling and the affordances around us to ensure that we're building the API right? But leading into that first question, the first thing that people really need to work out when it comes to are we building the right API is what problem are we trying to solve? Do we have a clear understanding of the requirements? And unfortunately, we haven't been doing a great job at uniformly classifying API requirements across the API landscape. So what are you using for API requirements? Are you using a business rules document? Maybe you're putting those requirements into a Confluence page. And maybe you're using some of your favorite tools like Jira or Azure DevOps, and you're crafting your acceptance criteria into those mediums. Maybe you're passing the burden onto your QA or testers, and you're asking them to codify their requirements into their test plans. And of course, we all know that customers love viewing test plans to see if there's any gaps in requirements. Or maybe you're more on the vibe side and you're scribbling the requirements on the back of a napkin. You're having a one-off chat with an AI co-pilot, and you're hoping that what's created will have sufficient annotations to allow for even basic documentation creation. And what I'm going to propose is that there's certain aspects of BDD, behavioral driven development, that are really well suited to helping us from an API delivery standpoint in the modern age. Because when we really think about an API is an interface to behavior, to capabilities. And what we want to do is strive to try and get to the point where we have living documentation that represents a clear understanding of that behavior and also represents meaningfully how this behavior should manifest itself from a runtime perspective. So if we look at the common BDD workflow, and this is the workflow that's been popularized by the Cucumber team, so the likes of Seb Rose and Aslak Helisoy, and it covers three phases. We have a discovery phase where everyone understands and gets on the same page with respect to what we should be building for. We then formulate that understanding into some type of human and machine readable form. And in the, let's say the BDD world, that's generally a Gherkin feature file. And then we use some form of tooling that can understand that and get us to the point where we're actually making dollars from having running software. But in the world of APIs, what I would say is that we have enough specifications already without adding something additive into the delivery cycle. And of course, as Milt Bryce, the father of systems methodology, puts it, good specifications will always improve programmer productivity far better than any programming tool or technique. And that's because they emit very, very desired properties. They're well structured with respect to things like information hiding. They have a standardized representation. They're simple to work with, generally efficient. They're also flexible with respect to dealing with requirement changes over time. They're never overly general nor too specific, and they're implementable. So we generally will find that tooling will spawn up around those specifications, allowing us to actually work with them. So again, if we go back to that BDD workflow and we look at this through a modern API delivery lens, we can use things like OpenAPI and Arazzo to perform the formulation and automation phase. And then zooming into why that's also applicable for the automation phase is, of course, we have this incredibly rich tooling ecosystem around these specifications that once we know what we're going to build and we work on formulating that as an API design, we then have the ability to spin up mocks, get a good start at the implementation, auto-generate some of the tests, help us generate documentation, and also provide SDKs and or boilerplate client implementations from a consumption perspective. So what I'm going to focus on is the discovery part. So how can we actually nail what we need to do and what problem we're trying to solve so we can then take it into this specification-driven workflow. And for that, I'm going to focus on something called example mapping for deliberate discovery. So of course, deliberate discovery is something that was created by Dan North, who's one of the founders of BDD. And example mapping is a technique crafted by somebody called Matt Wynn. And I had the pleasure of working with Matt for a number of years. And the technique focuses on having real human cross-discipline conversations to help us get to an agreed understanding of what we want to do. So I identify as much uncertainty upfront as possible, and that leads to better predictability. We can assess if something is ready to work on or not, and we do so by identifying concrete examples. And it also helps in kind of the old agile adage of thinking about, unknown unknowns. So we will use these structured collaborative conversations to identify these unknown unknowns. Once they're kind of in our sights and we have discovered them, they then become known unknowns. So then we can go off and find answers, eventually allowing us to be able to classify them as known knowns, and we can put them on our backlog. So example mapping. So what does it look like and what do we need in order to be able to perform it? Well, all we really need from a requirements perspective is to be working in some methodology that has user stories or some type of similar mechanism. And then after that, you just need 4 colored cards. So if you're working kind of co-located, it's best to have these conversations face-to-face. If you're remote, then you can use things like Miro and Mural, and they have templates that actually support the example mapping process. So what will generally happen is you will have a yellow card that stores the user story, and generally the product owner will bring along a user story for discussion, and they'll also have crafted some business rules on blue cards. The examples that you will kind of interactively discover as a group of people to come to that common understanding go on green cards. And then if there's ever a question or an assumption that needs to be stated, they go on a red card. So zooming a little bit into the example, an example has a particular anatomy. So it has a context, an action, and an outcome. And then when we think about who should participate in these types of sessions and conversations, generally in the BDD world, these are known as a 3 amigos session. So you'll have the product owner who represents the customer requirements. You'll have a developer and you will have a QA or a tester from the team. You can have more from the team at the start so that everybody becomes familiar. And generally these are short, snappy sessions. So they're 20-25 minute sessions. They happen like every other day. You don't have a big 3-hour long planning session at the start of your iteration. You're continuously doing this work to get to a common understanding of what you need to build. And in the world of APIs, if you're working with a Center for Enablement, even a Center for Excellence, or you have an API guild or a community of practice, these are the ideal sessions for those SMEs to participate. So what I would highly recommend is that you have API designers or architects. These should come in and participate in these sessions, because what we want to do when we set up those kind of constructs within our organization is we want to move from ivory tower governance to getting all teams within our organization understanding API governance and why we do things in a particular way. So make sure that these folks participate. So let's now run through an example of what this would look like. So let's imagine we all are now working for a company called Petco, and we have a business problem. So we're being overwhelmed by the number of pets that are being abandoned at our pet store. So we've done our independent research and evaluation, and we've decided that if we create the ability to search for and adopt pets that we catalog, then it will help us solve our problem. We will offer that service via our website and proprietary mobile app, but we'll also make it available to a broader ecosystem of shelters, charities, and pet orphanages, maybe even into chat interfaces like ChatGPT or Claude. So the first user story that we'll tackle from an example mapping perspective is search for pets. So the product owner sets up this 3 amigos plus API SMEs session, brings along the search for pets user story and 2 business rules. Calling the search pets resource returns all available pets, and pets can be filtered by status, category, location, and breed. And then collaboratively, we work on these examples. So again, remember the context of an example. It has the context, the action, and the outcome. So one example here would be, well, Jane calls the search pets resource and all details of available pets are returned. And then this is where the API designer actually brings in their expertise and says, well, actually the pet details schema is quite verbose. So instead we should create a summary object. So summary of pet details and return that instead. So by having this conversation, the team have learned about this new business rule that they need to honor to create a pet summary, and it should have name, ID, status, category, breed, and location. Then the API architect has something to say, and they say, well, we shouldn't return all of anything. We should never run the risk of overloading the server. So we should be returning a paged summary of details for these types of endpoints. So now the team have learned about this API standard that exists within Petco, and they can really move it from being this ivory tower statement of an API standard into really understanding it in the context of this particular user story that they're tackling. So then they continue with the example mapping session. So Jane searches for adopted status pets, and a page summary of adopted pets are returned. Jane searches for pets located in Galway. A page summary of Galway located pets are returned. Jane searches for cats. Page summary of cats, regardless of location, status, or breed, are returned. And then Jane searches for boxer breed cats, and an empty response is returned. And actually, the product owner was really expecting this to result in an error. But again, the API designer, excuse me, the API designer explains to the product owner that this wasn't an issue caused by Jane. So Jane just provided some search criteria that didn't find any matches in our pets catalog, but it's not an error on Jane's behalf. And if this type of scenario occurs, we should just return a empty response and not an error. So again, the team is learning about this new standard and why it's applicable across Petco. So what does so let's imagine the team finishes the example mapping session, and then we want to take a look at what automation looks like. And here is where I'm seeing we can, move from the low-tech technique, realize all of the value that came from that session, and then we can move into an AI augmented formulation process. And for that, I would propose that we would have this type of system prompt pipeline. So the human is responsible for the example mapping sessions and then converting those into a prompt, as well as generating a system prompt that will allow an LLM backend to generate an OpenAPI description. We then pass that into the LLM of choice. The result should be an OpenAPI document. And again, we never just blindly trust that. So we should utilize the tooling around OpenAPI to ensure that it's a valid OpenAPI description. And there should always be human validation as part of the process to ensure that this is what we expect. Then remember, what we want to expose towards our UX team and also towards our external partners for other pet shelters is the whole workflow around adopting a pet. So then we have another prompt pipeline that will take an OpenAPI description, will take the intent of the workflow that we want to create, we'll utilize an Arazzo system prompt for that, and it will generate an Arazzo workflow document that will express this workflow, and we can use that then to also help us generate tests and generate developer and agent related documentation. Again, validate with the tooling, is this correct? And again, validate from a human perspective, is it doing what we expect? So let's take a look at this in action. So here we have all of the example maps that we just showed. I then converted them into just a markdown prompt. And here is the system prompt for generating the OpenAPI description. So those two things combined will hopefully give us an OpenAPI description representing this user story. So I'm just going to paste in this prompt, and this is just a lab environment that we have at SmartBear for testing out some of our capabilities, but this has now been integrated or will possibly be integrated into our API hub. I'm just pasting it into Swagger Editor here for demo purposes. So we can see we have the search for pets, all of the query parameters that we discussed are there, and all of the error scenarios following the RFC for problem details are also being honored. So quite a good looking OpenAPI description. But again, I'm not going to blindly trust it. I'm going to lint it with Spectral against our Petco standards and see if it's correct or not. So we can see there's no errors. There's a few opinionated warnings, that's fine, but generally a pretty high quality deliverable, much quicker than I'd be able to generate by hand. So then you can imagine the teams go through the rest of the example mapping sessions. So one for view pet details, add a new pet, adopt a pet, get pet adoptions. And what's actually happening here, if you see on the right-hand side, is that the team is subconsciously building up this repertoire of API standards, and now they're becoming known. So again, a really practical way to get API governance infused into the ground floor for your teams. So let's then take all of these example mappings and work towards the scenario where we can unlock the workflow and make this workflow for adopting a pet available to the consumers. So what we want to do is expose two APIs, Pet API and an Adoptions API, and the workflow to adopt a pet, which would be integrated into one of those third-party systems or our own website or proprietary mobile app, would be the steps that are outlined there to fully execute the Adopt Pets workflow. So again, going into our more automation phase for doing this, we have all of the example mapping session outputs from those sessions. We put that into a longer form prompt. And again, we generate our OpenAPI description. I'm going to paste this back into Swagger Editor. So you see all of the additional endpoints here for the pets resource. Now we have the full pets catalog API. I'm going to lint that and again, determine if it's following our standards. Again, no errors, a few warnings, that's fine. And now I'm going to work on providing the workflow prompt. So I've done the Pets API behind the scenes. I also did the Adoptions API. Now I'm specifying the 4 steps that are in the workflow. And I'm going to ask for an Arazzo document to be generated based on those 2 open API descriptions and conforming to all of the steps that we had outlined. So I'm just going to paste in the updated prompt behind the scenes and send the message, and we get an Arazzo document back. And again, I don't trust what the LLM will return. So I'm going to validate, and this is again a valid Arazzo document. And then I'm going to take that Arazzo document and ask for developer portal documentation to be created to improve the developer experience. And what I want to do is in my portal, I want to see an Adopt a Pet product pop up here. So I'm going to provide the outputs of that, run it through the spell check, validating, linting the API, and eventually publishing it into our developer portal. So now I have an Adopt Pets product. It has the 2 APIs, the Pets API, the Adoptions API, and it has this very, very nice getting started guide, which explicitly determines the steps and the parameters, as well as sample code in C# and TypeScript, just for example purposes. So very, very quickly getting to iterate through that process so that I have something that I can start sharing with the consuming teams and getting feedback. Is this going to help them integrate this as fast as possible? So the workflow that we're doing here is we're working quite heavily to understand the customer requirements. We're taking those into the 3 Amigos plus API SMEs session. We're generating the example mappings. We're validating again with the customer. If we do all of these things, will this solve this particular requirement? If that's yes, then we can move into a scenario where we can have human and AI augmented auto generation of things like OpenAPI. And from there, we can determine, is this an approved candidate to move into the next phases of delivery? And again, we can have AI helping us generate code, generate tests, generate developer documentation, and again, all following our standards. So what I would say is, what we always need to remember is that we have to start with the customer journey when it comes to our APIs, and not just the interface, because our APIs that we're making available are there to power someone else's outcome. So we should focus on that first. And if we can use low-tech techniques like example mapping, we're keeping people at the center of API delivery, and we're utilizing that as our best alignment tool. Because if we want to deliver better DX and AX, we should do so and share that same foundation. So clear contextual documentation and specifications. And what I would advise to everyone is bet on specifications as your contract for interoperability. So things like OpenAPI and Arazzo and the rich documentation, they're not just outputs. They're actually what bridges and creates the bridges that connects teams, tools, and also the new wave of API consumers, which are agents. So if we always treat our API as a promise, we have all of the mechanisms in place to let it tell its story. Thank you very much. If you'd like to learn anything more about this, feel free to connect with me, and I would be happy to share some of our experiments and some of our learnings in this area. Thank you.